So self-hosting, if you're not familiar with it, is a way of saying, I do not want to host this thing inside a web server. I don't want to use Internet Information Server. I want to write an application that hosts this thing, and I'm going to run it as a Windows service, for example. So I don't want to have to install and configure IIS. I want to create a piece of software that I can install and register as a service, and it will start up when Windows boots, and it's going to host my web API stuff for me. And if you're just publishing an API and there's no accompanying website, then why bother with IIS? Well, there are some reasons you might bother with IIS, because it can be a pain to install and manage and so on, but it is also capable of doing caching and scaling and being a web farm with 15 different instances and automatically load balancing across them and resilience and all of that kind of stuff are all good reasons to do web hosting in a web server. But if your requirements are simple and you don't need an HTML UI and that kind of stuff, nothing wrong with self-hosting. The way you implement self-hosting with Web API is you use something called OWIN. So OWIN stands for the Open Web Interface for .NET, and it's a thing you can get from Nuget. It's a Microsoft thing. It used to be called Katana. If you're watching some stuff online, you might frequently see it referred to as Katana. And it's basically a sample environment for implementing self-hosting mechanisms for ASP.NET Web API. And it's pretty straightforward. So, rather than talk about it, let's just do it. So what we are going to do, I'm going to host, just to keep it really simple, I'm not going to go and create a Windows service and register it and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to keep it really simple. We're going to go to our solution and I'm going to say File, Add, New Project, and I'm going to add a Synergy console application, just a good old command line text-based console application. And we will call this self-host, okay? And we will add that to our solution. We are going to need a couple of things in there. We are going to need Web API, and we're going to need OWIN, both of which are NuGet things. So we're going to go off to Manage NuGet Packages. I'm going to go browse for, there's a few of them, you've got to make sure you pick the right one. The one we are looking for, Microsoft ASP.NET Web API OWIN Self-Host is what you're looking for. And we're going to add that into our self-hosting project. And one of its dependencies is Web API. So this is going to bring all the Web API stuff in for me as well, Web API core, client, and so on. So now we have Web API and OWIN available in our console application. All right, how do we set up self-hosting? What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new class. So let's go to our self-host. We're going to do a project, add class. I'm going to create a class called startup, okay, and then I'm going to add a public method to it. So we'll use the public method, and I'm going to call it public method configuration, comma, void, and then we're going to add some code to start up the environment. OWIN hands you something called an iApp builder, and what we can do is we need to create ourselves a new HTTP configuration, okay, and then we need to do some configuration. Now you might recognize this code because it's basically the exact same stuff we were doing in the Web API config in the C# web host. Okay, so we're going to do a config.routes.map HTTP route, default API, API controller /ID, route param, optional. There's our default routing rule that was present, and then we hand it back. App builder was what was passed in, use Web API, and here's the config. That's the pattern for setting up OWIN self-hosting. Beyond that, we're just going to configure our environment however we need to, exactly the same as we were in the web application. Okay, we're going to need to access our Synergy stuff. So in our self-host, just like we did in our web application, we're going to add a reference to the project Web API services. So that gets me access to my Synergy class library that's got all my Web API services in it. Now we can complete our customizations based on our Synergy stuff. So we need to bring in our Unity resolver, like we had in C#, and we need to resolve that namespace. Okay. We also need to bring in our global filter that was doing our model validation. So basically we're configuring this self-hosting environment exactly the same as we configured it in the C# environment, in the web application. We didn't talk about this one earlier. I probably should have done. I kind of skipped over it in the configuration. It was there by default, but there was also config.map HTTP attribute routes. That's what enables the use of those route prefix and route attributes in the controller classes. Without that, you can't do that, and it only uses the routing table. But that, again, is there in the default configuration in the web hosting application. And that's basically it. This environment now should, in theory, look like our IIS or our C# web application, ASP.NET web application. So that's our configuration, our startup class. Now we just need to create an instance of it and host it. Okay? So what we're going to do is, first of all, we're going to go to our project properties. And as Steve said, we need our environment variables. Well, we're in Synergy now. Okay, so I've already got them set up as common properties. I just need to opt into the common properties scheme. Some of them are development time stuff. I don't need the RPS DAT and so on. You know, in the real world, I wouldn't be running this inside Visual Studio, so I'd need to do this another way. I'd probably use an app.config file and read the app.config and set them at runtime or whatever I do. But yes, I'm relying on the fact that I'm running in Visual Studio by doing this. So there's our logical names. Let's close that. And then we need to just host the thing. So we're going to go to program.dbl. Remember, we're in a console application, so it's just a simple command line program. Here's program.dbl, main, proc, end main. Oh, we're in DBL. Good, cool. All we need to do is go like that. So I've declared a variable called base address, string, and I'm, pick a number, localhost. I can't just use localhost because that would be defaulting to port 80, and I've already got IIS running on port 80. If I haven't got IIS installed, I could just use localhost and just host it on port 80 like normal. But here I'm saying, let's use port 8088. That's not going to clash with anything else that's out there. And then I'm creating a disposable data app is webapp.start, naming the startup method in the class, the startup class. So it's going to go off and find our startup class, and in there it's going to expect to find a method called configuration, and it's going to call it, because that's what Web API does. And that's basically it. Now, this is a console app, so as soon as that's happened, threading stuff is happening behind the scenes, but now it's going to hit end main and stop. So I just need to make the thing persist somehow. And in a console app, the easiest way to do that, we just need to bring in web app. Needs to be brought in as Microsoft OWIN hosting, and we need to make the thing live until some later time. So we'll just put a few console.write lines and a console.read key, wait for a key press, basically, and there we go. So this one line starts and hosts our Web API environment. It reads the configuration, executes those configuration things, and starts hosting. And just discovers controllers and exposes them, just like the web application did. Okay? So if we make sure this builds, and hopefully it does, we should be able to just say set our startup project, and we should be able to just run it. There's the console app running on port localhost 8088, and in theory, if we go to Postman, now I've already got a configuration configured, and it's called workshop demo self-host, which if we look at it, my base address is localhost 8088. Okay, so that's all I'm changing here. I'm going to select that configuration, self-host. So now all of my tests should go to my self-hosted service. And just to make sure, so you're sure there's no smoke and mirrors, let's go to IIS. And let's just close down IIS for the time being. So I'll just stop IIS so we know any response is not coming from there. And if I go for, which one should we go for? Employee, let's do a get all departments, send. There we go. There's our 2 departments. Oh, sorry, get 1089. Let's do get all departments. There we go. There's our 10 departments. Let's go and look at our employees controller and do our get all employees body. There we go. It's the same service. All we're doing is we're not using IIS anymore. We're hosting it inside this little console application, which, okay, that's not very realistic. It's fine for development, but you know, in the real world, exactly the same thing, but in a Windows service, and you fire off that code in the startup event of the Windows service. Again, as Richard would say, Bob's your uncle. Let's just approve it. All I'm going to do is close that down, so we're not hosting anymore, and IIS is stopped. So in theory, if I run my Postman test, it's going to try a while, and it's going to eventually say no response. Okay?